In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists one universal truth that every advanced species has learned to respect. Know when you're beaten. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 17 star systems without breaking a sweat. Their soldiers were engineered for perfection, their technology centuries ahead of primitive worlds, and their military doctrine had never failed them. Until they met Earth. What started as a routine planetary acquisition turned into the most bewildering military campaign in galactic history. The humans didn't follow the rules. They didn't surrender when outgunned. They didn't negotiate when outmaneuvered. Instead, they did something that defied all logic and tactical understanding. They fought harder when things got worse. Commander Thexay of the Zephyrian 47th Assault Legion thought he understood warfare. He had studied every known military strategy, witnessed the surrender of countless civilizations, and believed that superior technology and numbers guaranteed victory. But as he stood in the smoking ruins of what should have been an easy conquest, watching his forces retreat for the third time from a species that barely had space travel, he began to question everything he knew about combat, courage, and the indomitable spirit that some beings possess. This is the story of how a single human world taught an alien soldier that sometimes the primitive species you underestimate can teach you the most profound lessons about what it truly means to never give up. It's about the moment when technological superiority meets unbreakable will, and how the galaxy learned that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat. Commander Thexay adjusted his ceremonial armor as the transport ship descended through Earth's atmosphere. The blue and green marble below him looked peaceful, almost primitive compared to the gleaming metal worlds of the Zephyrian Empire. His 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern on his elongated skull, scanned the tactical displays with practiced efficiency. Everything was proceeding exactly as predicted. The reconnaissance data painted a clear picture of humanity's capabilities. They had barely achieved faster-than-light travel, their weapons still relied on primitive projectiles and chemical explosives, and their military forces were fragmented into hundreds of separate nation-states. By Zephyrian standards, conquering Earth should take no more than 72 standard hours. The humans would see the overwhelming technological superiority of the invasion force, recognize the futility of resistance, and surrender according to established galactic protocols. Thexay had overseen 17 such conquests during his career. Each followed the same predictable pattern: initial shock, brief resistance, rational assessment of the situation, and inevitable capitulation. The conquered species were always grateful afterward, once they experienced the benefits of Zephyrian civilization. Advanced medical technology, interstellar travel, and protection under the Empire's vast military umbrella more than compensated for the loss of planetary autonomy. The bridge of the command vessel hummed with quiet efficiency as his officers coordinated the final approach. Subcommander Kelnas, his tactical advisor, approached with a datapad containing the latest intelligence updates. "Sir, our deep space monitors have intercepted and analyzed their communication networks. The humans appear to be aware of our arrival but show no signs of coordinating a unified defensive response. Their largest military powers are actually positioning forces against each other, apparently still concerned about their local territorial disputes even in the face of our approach." Thexay's mandibles clicked in amusement. Typical primitive behavior. They cannot see beyond their tribal conflicts long enough to recognize a true external threat. "Have our diplomatic protocols been transmitted to their leadership?"
"Yes, Commander."
"The standard surrender terms have been broadcast in their primary languages. We offered the usual conditions: peaceful integration into the Empire, preservation of their cultural identity within acceptable parameters, and technological advancement in exchange for resource rights and military cooperation." "And their response?" Kelmas hesitated for a moment, his scaled features showing confusion. "Their responses have been inconsistent, sir. Some of their leadership groups have requested more time to consider the terms. Others have rejected our offer entirely and made statements about defending their independence. A few have even issued what appear to be threats against our forces." The commander's secondary eyes narrowed. Empty threats were common during first contact scenarios, but they usually subsided quickly once the invading force demonstrated its technological superiority. "Show them our strength, Sub-Commander." Deploy the demonstration protocol over one of their major population centers. Nothing destructive, simply a show of our shield technology and maneuverability. Once they witness our capabilities firsthand, their bravado will evaporate. The fleet moved into position above the North American continent, selecting a large metropolitan area as the demonstration site. HFY watched through the tactical display as 3 Zephyrian cruisers descended to low altitude, their energy shields shimmering like aurora as they absorbed and deflected the primitive missiles and projectiles fired from the ground below. The display was meant to be awe-inspiring, vessels the size of city blocks moving with impossible grace, completely immune to humanity's most advanced weapons. But something unexpected happened during the demonstration. Instead of the usual stunned silence or immediate surrender signals, the human military forces intensified their attacks. More aircraft scrambled from airfields across the continent. Military bases increased their alert status, and communication traffic spiked as defensive preparations accelerated worldwide. "Sir," his communications officer reported with obvious bewilderment, "we're receiving thousands of messages from the planet's surface, but none of them are surrender offers. They appear to be rallying their forces for combat." HFY studied the incoming data streams with growing confusion. The humans had witnessed a clear demonstration of their technological inferiority. Their weapons couldn't even scratch the shields of his ships, yet instead of accepting reality, they were mobilizing for a fight they couldn't possibly win. It defied all logic and established patterns of conquest. Perhaps they didn't understand the demonstration, he mused aloud. Deploy ground forces to 3 major military installations. Capture them intact, but make our overwhelming advantage clear. Once they see our soldiers in action, surely they'll realize the futility of resistance. The first ground assault targeted a major military base in what their intelligence identified as the United States. HFY expected the operation to last no more than a few hours. His soldiers were genetically enhanced warriors, standing nearly 8 feet tall with natural armor plating and reflexes 3 times faster than baseline humans. Their weapons could punch through armored vehicles and their personal shields could deflect most primitive projectiles. The battle began at dawn, local time. 3 companies of Zephyrian infantry, supported by hover tanks and aerial drones, approached the military installation with overwhelming force. The humans had hastily erected defensive positions around the perimeter, but their preparations looked almost quaint compared to Zephyrian military engineering. The initial assault proceeded exactly as predicted. Zephyrian forces advanced steadily, their shields absorbing human gunfire while their energy weapons systematically destroyed defensive positions. Within 2 hours, they had breached the main perimeter and were advancing toward the central command structures. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of surrendering or retreating, the human defenders fell back to secondary positions and continued fighting. When those positions became untenable, they retreated further and established new defensive lines. Each time the Zephyrians expected to receive surrender signals, the humans instead adapted their tactics and continued resistance. "Sir," Captain Vexthor's voice crackled through the communication link from the surface. "The humans are displaying unusual behavior. They've lost over 60% of their defensive positions, but they refuse to yield. They're actually using our destroyed equipment to strengthen their remaining fortifications." HFY frowned as he studied the tactical displays. The human resistance was indeed continuing far longer than any rational assessment would suggest. They were clearly outmatched in every measurable category, yet they kept fighting with a determination that bordered on irrationality. "Perhaps their command structure has been disrupted," he suggested. "It's possible their leaders cannot communicate surrender orders to the ground forces." But as reports came in from the other 2 assault sites, the same pattern emerged. Human forces continued fighting even when surrounded, even when taking heavy casualties, even when any logical analysis would conclude that further resistance was pointless. They used terrain to their advantage, improvised weapons from battlefield debris, and showed remarkable adaptability in developing new tactics against Zephyrian equipment. Most disturbing of all was their apparent disregard for their own casualties. Zephyrian military doctrine emphasized minimizing losses while achieving objectives efficiently, but these humans seemed willing to accept devastating losses if it meant inflicting even minor damage on the invading forces. They positioned explosive devices to destroy their own installations rather than let them fall intact. and individual soldiers often chose to fight to the death rather than retreat when their positions became hopeless. By the end of the first day, what should have been a routine demonstration of superior force had become a grinding, bloody campaign with no clear resolution in sight. HFY found himself staring at casualty reports that made no sense according to established military theory. His forces were winning every engagement, controlling more territory, and maintaining their technological advantages, but somehow the humans were still fighting. Sub-Commander Kelness, he called to his tactical advisor, "Review our intelligence on human psychology and military doctrine. There must be something we're missing. No rational species continues fighting under these conditions." Kelness consulted his data archives, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he read. "Commander, our xenopsychology experts classified humans as a standard Class 7 species. Moderate intelligence, tribal social structures, minimal technological development. They should respond to overwhelming force exactly as other Class 7 civilizations have. The psychological profile indicates they should be primarily motivated by survival and resource acquisition, with limited capacity for abstract concepts like honor or ideological commitment." "Then explain to me why they're acting like a Class 3 warrior culture without the technological development to support such behavior." The sub-commander had no answer. Neither did the rest of his staff as they watched the tactical displays showing continued human resistance across all 3 assault sites. The humans were losing the battles in every measurable sense, but they absolutely refused to accept defeat. As night fell over the contested areas, HFY made a decision that he had never needed to make in 17 previous conquests. He ordered his forces to consolidate their positions and prepare for extended operations. For the first time in his military career, he was facing an enemy that didn't follow the established rules of warfare. The humans had forced him to adapt his strategy, and that realization was more disturbing than any tactical setback. They were supposed to be the primitive species learning hard lessons about superior technology and inevitable defeat. Instead, they were teaching him that his understanding of warfare might be incomplete. Standing on his command deck, looking down at the blue-green world that refused to surrender, HFY began to wonder if the Zephyrian Empire's greatest military minds had made a fundamental miscalculation about humanity. Perhaps their real weapon wasn't any technology or tactical doctrine, it was their apparent inability to recognize when they were beaten. The thought should have been reassuring. After all, his forces still maintained overwhelming advantages in technology, numbers, and tactical position. But as he watched the tactical displays showing continued human resistance through the night, HFY felt the first stirrings of something he had never experienced in his military career: uncertainty about the eventual outcome of what should have been a routine conquest. 3 weeks into what had been planned as a 72-hour operation, Commander HFY found himself facing a situation that no Zephyrian military academy had prepared him for. The humans had not only failed to surrender, they had somehow managed to turn their desperate defense into something resembling an effective resistance movement. The morning briefing brought news that would have been impossible to believe during his previous conquests. Captain Vexthor stood before the assembled command staff, his usually pristine armor scarred and patched from weeks of continuous combat. His report painted a picture of an enemy that defied every established principle of military science. "The humans have adapted their tactics again," Vexthor began, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "They've stopped trying to meet our forces in direct confrontation. Instead, they've developed what they call guerrilla warfare. They strike quickly at isolated patrols, inflict casualties, and disappear before we can respond effectively." HFY's primary eyes focused on the tactical hologram showing the current state of operations. Red markers indicated confirmed human resistance cells, yellow showed suspected activity, and blue represented secure Zephyrian-controlled territory. The map looked like a disease spreading through his carefully planned occupation zones. "They're using their knowledge of local terrain to their advantage," the captain continued. "Our hover tanks are superior to their vehicles on open ground, but they've learned to force engagements in urban areas, forests, and mountainous terrain where our technological advantages are minimized. They've also begun using improvised explosive devices made from materials that our sensors have difficulty detecting." Sub-Commander Kelness interrupted with his own disturbing observations. "Sir, Our intelligence networks have identified another concerning development. The humans appear to be sharing tactical information across their various military organizations. Despite having no unified command structure when we arrived, they've somehow coordinated their defensive efforts on a global scale. The tactical display shifted to show communication intercepts and movement patterns. Texay studied the data with growing bewilderment. The humans had indeed managed to create an effective resistance network despite their primitive communication technology and historically fragmented military forces. They were sharing successful tactics, coordinating supply lines, and even transferring personnel between combat zones to spread effective techniques. How are they accomplishing this coordination? Texay demanded. Our deep space monitors show that we've successfully disrupted their primary communication satellites, and our electronic warfare systems are jamming most of their radio frequencies. They've reverted to older communication methods, his intelligence officer reported. Physical courier networks, coded messages hidden in civilian broadcasts, and even optical signaling systems. They're also using their civilian internet infrastructure in ways we didn't anticipate, embedding military communications in seemingly harmless social media posts and commercial data transfers. The commander felt his mandibles clicking in involuntary agitation. Every time his forces adapted to counter one human tactic, the enemy developed new approaches. It was like fighting a hydra that grew stronger each time they cut off one of its heads. There's something else, Captain Vexthor continued reluctantly. The continuous combat, the unpredictable nature of human tactics, and the enemy's apparent disregard for casualties are affecting morale. Yesterday, 3 soldiers requested transfer to non-combat duties, citing emotional exhaustion. That news struck Texay like a physical blow. Zephyrian soldiers were genetically engineered for mental resilience and had undergone decades of psychological conditioning. The idea that they could be affected by prolonged exposure to human resistance was unprecedented. In 17 previous conquests, his forces had maintained peak psychological condition throughout operations that typically lasted only days. The briefing continued with more disturbing revelations. Human resistance fighters had begun targeting Zephyrian supply lines with increasing effectiveness. They had somehow acquired knowledge of optimal strike points on Zephyrian equipment, despite having no previous exposure to the technology. Most alarming of all, they had started capturing Zephyrian weapons and equipment, reverse engineering them with remarkable speed, and developing countermeasures. "Show me the incident from Sector 7, Texay commanded, his voice tight with controlled frustration. The holographic display shifted to show recorded footage from a supply convoy ambush. Texay watched as human fighters emerged from concealed positions with captured Zephyrian energy weapons, coordinating their attack with precision that shouldn't have been possible for a primitive species. They disabled the convoy's shields using tactics that suggested intimate knowledge of Zephyrian defensive systems, then vanished into the terrain before reinforcements could arrive. How did they learn our shield frequencies? He asked. We believe they're conducting detailed analysis of battlefield debris, the intelligence officer replied. They collect fragments of destroyed equipment, analyze the technology using their own scientific methods, and somehow extract useful tactical information. Their learning curve appears to be exponential. Texay studied the faces of his command staff, noting the uncertainty and confusion that had replaced their initial confidence. These were experienced officers who had participated in multiple successful conquests, yet they were displaying the same bewilderment he felt when confronting human tactics. The humans were forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Superior technology meant nothing if your enemy refused to fight according to established rules. The Zephyrian military machine was designed for swift, decisive campaigns against rational opponents who understood the mathematics of warfare. But humanity appeared to operate on different mathematical principles entirely. Sir, Subcommander Kelnaz spoke up hesitantly, perhaps we should consider alternative approaches. The humans have rejected our diplomatic overtures, but they might be more receptive to negotiation now that they've experienced our military capabilities firsthand. Absolutely not, Texay responded immediately. The Empire does not negotiate with primitive species from a position of weakness. We will adapt our strategy to counter their irregular tactics. But even as he spoke those words, the commander recognized the irony in his statement. For the first time in his career, he was the one being forced to adapt. The humans had seized the initiative in a conflict where they should have been completely powerless. He ordered a shift in operational focus. Instead of attempting to hold territory, his forces would concentrate on eliminating human leadership and destroying their capacity to coordinate resistance. Orbital bombardment would target military installations and suspected command centers. Ground forces would focus on mobility and rapid strikes rather than static occupation. The new strategy showed initial promise. Several major human military facilities were destroyed from orbit, and rapid assault teams successfully eliminated known resistance cells. For a brief period, it seemed like the Zephyrians had regained control of the campaign's momentum. But the humans adapted again, faster than should have been possible. They decentralized their command structure, making it impossible to eliminate their leadership through targeted strikes. They moved their operations underground, literally, using natural cave systems and hastily constructed tunnels to avoid orbital bombardment. They even learned to mask their heat signatures and communications patterns to evade Zephyrian sensors. Most disturbing of all was their psychological resilience. No matter how many installations were destroyed, how many resistance cells were eliminated, or how many casualties they suffered, the humans refused to break. If anything, their determination seemed to strengthen in direct proportion to the losses they endured. "Sir," his communications officer announced during the 4th week of operations, "we're receiving a transmission from the human leader they call the President of the United States. Put it through," Tex High commanded, hoping that sanity had finally prevailed among the human leadership. The holographic display showed a middle-aged human male standing in what appeared to be an underground facility. His clothing was rumpled, his face showed signs of stress and fatigue, but his eyes held a determination that reminded Thexai uncomfortably of the resistance fighters his soldiers faced daily. "Commander Thexai," the human began, somehow knowing exactly who he was addressing, "I'm speaking for all the free nations of Earth when I say that we will never surrender to your forces. You've shown us your technology, your superior weapons, and your military might, but you've failed to understand the most important thing about humanity." The commander leaned forward, genuinely curious about what the primitive leader thought he could teach a Zephyrian military officer. "We don't fight because we expect to win easily," the president continued. "We fight because some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Freedom, self-determination, the right to chart our own destiny among the stars. You've offered us technological advancement and protection, but you've demanded our independence in return. That's not a trade we're willing to make." Thexai felt his secondary eyes narrowing as he studied the human's expression. There was no bluster, no empty threats, just a calm statement of absolute resolve that was somehow more unsettling than any military challenge. "Every day you remain on our world, we learn more about your technology, your tactics, and your weaknesses. Every battle teaches us something new. Every casualty we suffer only strengthens our resolve. You may eventually win this war through superior firepower, but you'll pay a price that will make your victory hollow." The transmission ended, leaving the Zephyrian command staff in uncomfortable silence. The human's words carried an implication that Thex High had been trying to avoid confronting. This conflict was changing from a routine conquest into something much more dangerous and unpredictable. As he dismissed his staff to implement new tactical adjustments, the commander found himself alone with thoughts that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. The humans were teaching him lessons about warfare that weren't covered in any military manual. They were showing him that technological superiority might not be enough when facing an enemy whose primary weapon was their absolute refusal to accept defeat. Looking at the tactical displays showing continued human resistance across every occupied zone, Thex High realized that he was no longer conducting a conquest. He was fighting a war, and for the first time in his military career, he wasn't certain who was going to win. 2 months into the campaign, Commander Thex High received a report that fundamentally changed his understanding of human capabilities. The document, compiled by his xenobiological analysis team, contained findings that challenged every assumption the Zephyrian Empire had made about primitive species. "Sir, Doctor." Yeltok began her scientific equipment humming softly as she presented her research. We've completed our comprehensive analysis of human physiology, psychology, and social behavior under extreme stress conditions. The results are unlike anything in our databases. HFY gestured for her to continue, though part of him dreaded what new impossibilities the humans had demonstrated now. Physiologically, humans are remarkable adaptive survivors. Their baseline physical capabilities are actually superior to our initial assessment suggested. Under stress, their bodies produce chemical compounds that dramatically increase strength, speed, and pain tolerance. They call this adrenaline response, and it allows them to perform feats that should be impossible given their normal physical parameters. The holographic display showed footage from recent combat encounters. HFY watched as human soldiers, many of them wounded and exhausted, continued fighting with an intensity that pushed their bodies beyond theoretical limits. One particular recording showed a human female lifting debris that should have required mechanical assistance, driven by the need to rescue trapped comrades. More significant is their psychological profile, Dr. Yeltok continued. Humans possess what they term neuroplasticity at levels we've never encountered. Their brains physically restructure themselves in response to new challenges. The longer this conflict continues, the more effectively their neural pathways optimize for combat conditions. Explain, HFY commanded, his four eyes focusing intently on the scientist. They're literally evolving during this campaign, sir. Not in the biological sense, but neurologically. Each engagement teaches them something new, and their brains integrate that knowledge with unprecedented efficiency. A human who survives 3 combat encounters is measurably more capable than one who has experienced only one. The implication sent a chill through HFY's enhanced nervous system. His forces were fighting an enemy that became more dangerous with each passing day. Not through external training or equipment upgrades, but through fundamental improvements in their basic cognitive abilities. There's more, the scientist continued. Their social bonding mechanisms are unlike anything in our xenopsychological databases. Under stress, humans form what they call battlefield bonds that transcend their normal tribal limitations. We've observed human soldiers from historically hostile nation-states working together with perfect coordination, driven by shared purpose rather than traditional loyalty structures. The tactical displays shifted to show communication intercepts from various human resistance cells. HFY listened as fighters from different continents, speaking different languages, coordinated complex operations using improvised codes and references that demonstrated intimate understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations. They're sharing not just tactical information, Dr. Hansen, Yeltok explained, but actual experiential knowledge. A successful technique developed by one resistance group appears in other cells thousands of kilometers away within days. They've created a distributed learning network that operates independently of any centralized command structure. Captain Vexthor, who had been listening silently, stepped forward with his own observations. Doctor, that explains something we'd been struggling to understand. Yesterday, my units encountered resistance fighters using tactics that were developed by a completely different group 3 continents away. We thought their communication networks were more sophisticated than we realized, but you're saying they're actually teaching each other to think differently. Precisely. Human learning isn't just informational, it's adaptive. They don't simply memorize successful techniques, they understand the underlying principles and apply them to new situations with remarkable creativity. HFY studied the data streams showing the expanding scope of human resistance. What had begun as desperate, uncoordinated defensive actions had evolved into sophisticated asymmetric warfare conducted by an enemy that improved its capabilities faster than his forces could adapt countermeasures. Show me the analysis of their technological development, he ordered. The holographic display shifted again, revealing perhaps the most disturbing aspect of human adaptability. In just 2 months, human engineers had not only reverse-engineered captured Zephyrian equipment, but had begun developing innovations that improved upon the original designs. They're using our own technology against us, Dr. Yeltok reported. But they're not simply copying our methods. They're finding ways to enhance performance using principles that our engineers never considered. Yesterday, we encountered improvised explosive devices that use modified Zephyrian power cells to generate electromagnetic pulses specifically tuned to disrupt our shield frequencies. How is that possible? Our technology is centuries ahead of their development level. That's precisely why they're succeeding, sir. They're not constrained by our assumptions about how the technology should work. When our engineers design equipment, they optimize within established parameters. But humans approach captured technology with completely fresh perspectives, seeing possibilities that we've been trained to ignore. The report included detailed analysis of human-modified Zephyrian weapons. HFY examined designs that somehow managed to be both primitive and revolutionary simultaneously. The humans had stripped away sophisticated control systems and replaced them with simpler mechanisms that were actually more reliable under battlefield conditions. They had modified energy weapons to function as tools, using focusing crystals from disabled vehicles to create improvised cutting devices for tunnel construction. Most impressively, they had learned to manufacture crude but functional versions of Zephyrian technology, using their own industrial capabilities. The quality was far below Zephyrian standards, but the devices worked, and they could be produced in quantities that made up for individual unit inferiority. "Sir," his intelligence officer interrupted with yet another troubling update. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that human academic institutions are conducting coordinated research into our technology. Universities, research laboratories, and even civilian scientists are contributing to their military adaptation efforts. Their entire civilization is participating in this resistance," Subcommander Kelnas observed with obvious admiration despite himself. "Not just their military forces, but their scientists, engineers, educators, and industrial workers. They've turned their entire species into a single adaptive organism focused on survival." The scope of human mobilization was indeed unprecedented. HFY reviewed intelligence reports showing factory workers developing new manufacturing techniques to produce resistance equipment, teachers creating educational programs to spread tactical knowledge, and even children contributing by gathering information about Zephyrian patrol patterns and equipment vulnerabilities. "There's one more thing," Dr. Yelpak added reluctantly. "We've detected evidence that humans are beginning to understand our psychological profiles as well. They're developing propaganda specifically designed to affect Zephyrian morale, and some of their tactical choices appear calculated to exploit our own mental conditioning." That revelation struck at the core of Zephyrian military doctrine. His soldiers were trained to be psychologically resilient, but their conditioning was based on facing rational opponents who fought according to established principles. The humans were deliberately violating those principles in ways that created unprecedented stress for troops who had never encountered such unpredictable enemies. "Yesterday," Captain Vexthor reported, "a human resistance cell surrendered to one of my patrols, but only after first broadcasting detailed recordings of their position and our tactical response. When we investigated, we realized they had deliberately allowed themselves to be captured in order to study our prisoner handling procedures. They were learning about us even in defeat." HFY felt his mandibles clicking in involuntary agitation as the full implications became clear. The humans weren't just fighting his forces. They were studying them, learning from every interaction, and constantly adapting their approach based on new intelligence. Every battle, every skirmish, every prisoner exchange was simultaneously a military engagement and a research opportunity for the human resistance. "What are your recommendations, Doctor?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Sir, the humans have demonstrated capabilities that exceed every established model for primitive species behavior. They're not responding to this conflict as predicted because they're not actually primitive in the ways that matter most. They may lack advanced technology, but they possess adaptive intelligence, social cohesion, and psychological resilience at levels that match or exceed our own." The scientist paused, seeming to gather courage for her next statement. "Based on current trends, continued engagement with human resistance forces will result in exponential improvement of their capabilities, while simultaneously degrading our own tactical advantages. The longer this conflict continues, the more dangerous they become." Standing alone on his command deck after dismissing his staff, HFY contemplated the tactical displays showing human resistance activity across the planet. Red markers indicating hostile activity had spread like an infection, covering vast areas that should have been secure under Zephyrian control. The humans had taught him something that 17 previous conquests had never demonstrated. Sometimes the technologically inferior opponent possessed advantages that couldn't be measured by conventional military analysis. They had turned their apparent weaknesses into strengths, their desperation into determination, and their ignorance into innovation. For the first time since assuming command, HFY began to consider the possibility that the Zephyrian Empire might have encountered something truly unprecedented, a species that became more formidable the longer they fought, regardless of their initial technological disadvantages. The thought should have been impossible, but as he watched real-time reports of continued human adaptation and resistance, he realized that his understanding of warfare, conquest, and the nature of military power itself might need fundamental revision. The humans were forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about the relationship between technology and victory. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that while his forces were becoming exhausted and demoralized by prolonged irregular warfare, the human resistance appeared to be gaining strength, confidence, and capability with each passing day. They had transformed what should have been a routine conquest into a learning experience that was changing both sides of the conflict in ways that no Zephyrian military planner had ever anticipated. The fourth month of operations brought Commander HFY face-to-face with a reality that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Zephyrian military doctrine. The humans had not only failed to surrender or break under pressure, they had somehow managed to seize tactical initiative in a conflict where they should have been completely powerless. The morning briefing began with news that would have been laughable during his previous 17 conquests. His communications officer stood at attention, but HFY could see the uncertainty in the way his subordinate's scales rippled with nervous energy. "Sir, we've received a formal communication from the human resistance leadership. They're requesting a parley to discuss terms." HFY's primary eyes focused sharply on the officer. "Terms of surrender?" "No, sir. Terms of Zephyrian withdrawal from Earth." The audacity of the message sent ripples of shock through the assembled command staff. For a primitive species to demand the withdrawal of a superior military force was unprecedented in galactic history. HFY himself struggled to process the implications of such a request. "They're offering us safe passage off their planet," the communications officer continued, "in exchange for immediate cessation of all military operations and a guarantee that the Zephyrian Empire will not attempt future conquest of Earth." Sub-Commander Kelness stepped forward, his expression showing the same bewilderment that HFY felt. "Sir, are they actually suggesting that they're in a position to negotiate from strength?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. According to every measurable military parameter, the Zephyrians maintained overwhelming superiority. They controlled orbital space, possessed vastly superior technology, and had inflicted significantly more casualties than they had suffered. By any rational analysis, the humans should be seeking mercy, not offering terms to their conquerors. "Show me the current tactical situation," HFY commanded. The holographic display materialized, revealing a strategic picture that defied traditional military logic. Zephyrian forces controlled most major population centers and strategic installations, but the areas between those strongholds were increasingly dominated by human resistance activity. Red markers indicating hostile presence now covered nearly 60% of the planet's surface area. "Explain to me how they believe they're in a position to make demands," HFY said, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Captain Vexthor stepped forward with the latest field reports. His armor bore new scars from recent engagements, and HFY noticed that his subordinate moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. "Sir, the humans have fundamentally altered the nature of this conflict. They've abandoned any attempt to defend fixed positions or protect traditional strategic assets. Instead, they've made our occupation so costly that maintaining control requires constant, exhausting effort." The captain activated detailed tactical displays showing typical occupation duties. "Every supply convoy requires heavy escort. Every communication relay needs permanent protection. Every administrative facility must be defended around the clock. Our forces are spread thin, maintaining security for infrastructure that the humans can attack at will." HFY studied the deployment patterns with growing unease. His soldiers were no longer conducting an aggressive conquest. They were defending against an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime, with minimal warning. The Zephyrians had been forced into a reactive posture, responding to human initiatives rather than implementing their own strategic objectives. They're not trying to win in any conventional sense, Dr. Yelpthok added from her analysis station. They're trying to make continued occupation unbearable for our forces. Every day we remain on Earth, they learn something new about our capabilities and limitations. Meanwhile, our troops become more exhausted, more stressed, and less effective. The xenobiologist's latest reports painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare that was unlike anything in Zephyrian experience. The humans had somehow learned to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Zephyrian mental conditioning, using tactics deliberately designed to maximize stress and uncertainty for occupying forces. They've learned to mimic our communication frequencies, the intelligence officer reported. False radio messages, imitated command codes, and psychological operations specifically targeted at our personnel. Yesterday, an entire patrol unit spent 6 hours responding to fabricated emergency calls that led them into carefully prepared ambush positions. More disturbing was the evidence that human resistance fighters were beginning to understand Zephyrian physiology well enough to develop targeted biological weapons. Nothing lethal, the humans seemed to prefer capture to killing when possible, but substances that could temporarily disable Zephyrian soldiers by affecting their enhanced respiratory systems or neural interfaces. Sir, Captain Vexthor continued reluctantly, there's another issue. Our casualties are light by traditional military standards, but our psychological casualties are unprecedented. Soldiers who have completed multiple tours of duty on other worlds are requesting medical discharge after just weeks of fighting human resistance. That revelation struck at the heart of Zephyrian military capability. Their soldiers were genetically engineered for psychological resilience and trained to maintain peak performance under extreme stress. The idea that human resistance could break down Zephyrian mental conditioning suggested that the enemy had developed psychological warfare techniques more advanced than anything the Empire had encountered. The humans have created an environment of constant uncertainty, Dr. Juvenile, Yaltok explained. Our troops never know when or where the next attack will come, what form it will take, or whether their routine missions will become combat situations. They're fighting an enemy that refuses to engage according to established military protocols. HFY reviewed the psychological profiles of his troops with growing concern. Stress indicators that should have remained stable throughout a normal conquest campaign were showing dangerous levels across all units. Sleep deprivation, anxiety disorders, and what human psychologists might recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress were affecting soldiers who should have been immune to such conditions. There's more, his intelligence officer added. Human resistance cells have begun specifically targeting our command structure, but not in the way we might expect. They're not trying to kill our officers, they're trying to capture them for interrogation and psychological analysis. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were actively studying their opponents to develop more effective resistance techniques. Every captured Zephyrian officer potentially provided intelligence that could be used to make future operations even more challenging. Show me the analysis of their latest tactical innovations. HFY commanded, dreading what new impossibilities the humans had developed. The holographic display revealed human engineering projects that bordered on the miraculous given their technological limitations. Using salvaged Zephyrian equipment and their own industrial capabilities, they had created weapons and defensive systems that were specifically designed to counter Zephyrian advantages. They've developed portable electromagnetic pulse devices that can temporarily disable our personal shields, Captain Vexthor reported. The technology is crude by our standards, but effective enough to level the playing field during close-quarters combat. They've also created communication jammers tuned to our specific frequencies and improvised armor that provides significant protection against our standard weapons. But the most disturbing development was evidence of human technological innovation that went beyond simple reverse engineering. They had begun developing entirely new approaches to problems that Zephyrian science had solved differently, creating solutions that were sometimes superior to established Imperial technology. Yesterday, we encountered human fighters using optical camouflage systems that our sensors couldn't detect, the intelligence officer reported. The technology is based on principles that our physicists dismissed as inefficient centuries ago, but the humans have made it work using creative applications that never occurred to our engineers. Thexai studied recordings of recent engagements, watching human fighters appear and disappear like ghosts, using technology that should have been impossible given their developmental level. They had somehow leapfrogged normal technological evolution by approaching problems from completely different conceptual frameworks. "Sir," Subcommander Kelnas spoke up hesitantly, "perhaps we should consider their offer of negotiation, not because we're militarily defeated, but because continued occupation may cost more than it's worth strategically." The suggestion would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the campaign, but Thexai found himself seriously considering it. The humans had managed to transform what should have been a valuable conquest into a resource-draining quagmire that offered diminishing returns for continued investment. "What exactly are they offering?" he asked. The communications officer consulted his records. "Immediate cessation of all resistance activities in exchange for complete Zephyrian withdrawal. They're also offering to share certain technological innovations they've developed during the conflict as a gesture of goodwill, provided we agree to a non-aggression treaty." The irony was overwhelming. The primitive species that should have been learning from Zephyrian technology was now offering to share their innovations with their supposed conquerors. It was a reversal of roles that challenged every assumption about the relationship between technological advancement and military superiority. "They've also included a warning," the officer continued reluctantly. "They claim that continued occupation will result in escalating resistance that will eventually spread beyond Earth to other worlds. They suggest that other species might learn from their example if we persist in trying to conquer them by force." That possibility sent a chill through Thexai's enhanced nervous system. If the human model of resistance spread to other worlds, the entire foundation of imperial expansion could be threatened. The Zephyrian Empire depended on the assumption that superior technology guaranteed successful conquest. If other species learned that determined resistance could make occupation unbearably costly, the Empire's expansion would grind to a halt. Standing alone on his command deck after dismissing his staff, Thexai contemplated the tactical displays with new understanding. The humans had achieved something that no previous enemy had accomplished. They had forced him to question whether victory was possible or even desirable. They had turned their technological inferiority into an advantage by refusing to fight according to established rules. They had transformed their desperation into innovation, their losses into learning opportunities, and their apparent defeat into a form of victory that challenged conventional definitions of military success. For the first time in his career, Commander Thexai found himself facing an enemy that had taught him more than he had taught them. The humans had shown him that sometimes the most powerful weapon was not superior technology or overwhelming force, but the absolute refusal to accept defeat combined with the intelligence to adapt and learn from every encounter. As he prepared to compose his response to the human offer of negotiation, Thexai realized that regardless of his decision, the Zephyrian Empire had already lost something irreplaceable: the certainty that technological superiority guaranteed victory against any determined opponent. The negotiation took place in what the humans called the neutral zone, a carefully selected location that demonstrated their understanding of Zephyrian psychology as much as their tactical sophistication. Commander Thexai found himself standing in a repurposed aircraft hangar, facing a delegation of humans who looked nothing like the primitive warriors his training had prepared him to encounter. The human delegation was led by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a former academic who had become one of the Resistance strategic coordinators. Beside her stood General Marcus Rodriguez, whose uniform bore the marks of recent combat, and Dr. James Morrison, a physicist whose work on captured Zephyrian technology had made him one of the most wanted individuals on the planet. What struck Thexai immediately was their demeanor. These weren't desperate primitives seeking mercy or conquered subjects pleading for better terms. They carried themselves with the confidence of equals entering into negotiations between sovereign powers. The psychological impact was profound and entirely intentional. "Commander Thexai," Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying the same calm determination he had heard in previous human communications. "We appreciate your willingness to discuss a peaceful resolution to this conflict." Thexai studied the assembled humans with his 4 eyes, noting details that his military training had taught him to observe. They were clearly exhausted from months of warfare, bearing the physical marks of prolonged stress and irregular nutrition. Yet their posture, their eye contact, and their manner of speaking suggested people who believed they were negotiating from a position of strength. "Dr. Chen," he responded, using the formal protocols his diplomatic training required, "the Zephyrian Empire is prepared to discuss terms, but I must clarify that this negotiation takes place between a superior military force and a resistance movement, not between equals." General Rodriguez smiled at that statement, an expression that somehow managed to be both respectful and slightly condescending. "Commander, with all due respect, I think the events of the past 4 months have demonstrated that traditional definitions of military superiority might need some revision." The general activated a portable holographic projector, clearly derived from captured Zephyrian technology but modified with human innovations, that displayed a three-dimensional map of current military positions. The tactical situation it revealed was more sobering than Pexai had wanted to acknowledge. "Your forces control approximately 37% of Earth's surface area," Rodriguez explained with the precision of a staff officer briefing superiors. "But maintaining that control requires 100% of your available personnel, operating at stress levels that have resulted in a 43% reduction in combat effectiveness over the past month." The accuracy of the human intelligence was disturbing enough, but Rodriguez continued with analysis that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Zephyrian military capabilities and limitations. "Our analysis suggests that extending your current occupation strategy would require a minimum tripling of deployed forces to achieve meaningful territorial control. Given the logistical constraints of maintaining supply lines across interstellar distances, such an expansion is economically unfeasible." Dr. Morrison stepped forward with additional technical analysis that struck at the heart of Zephyrian strategic planning. "Commander, we've studied your equipment and tactics extensively. Your technology is indeed superior to ours in most respects, but it's optimized for conventional warfare against opponents who fight according to established military doctrine. Your advantages diminish significantly when facing asymmetric resistance." The physicist activated another display showing human adaptations of Zephyrian technology. "We've learned to reverse engineer your systems not because we're trying to copy them, but because we needed to understand their vulnerabilities. Every technological advantage you possess has corresponding weaknesses that can be exploited by opponents willing to accept higher casualty ratios." Thexay found himself genuinely impressed despite his frustration. The humans had conducted a more thorough analysis of Zephyrian capabilities than many Imperial strategic planning committees managed to achieve. Their understanding of his force's strengths and limitations was uncomfortably accurate. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, settling into his command posture despite the informal setting. Chen took the lead in outlining the human position. "Complete withdrawal of all Zephyrian military forces from Earth and its orbital space. In exchange, we guarantee immediate cessation of all resistance activities and agree to a 25-year non-aggression treaty." "That's hardly an exchange," Subcommander Kelnas interjected. "You're offering to stop attacking us if we leave your world. That's a unilateral concession on our part." General Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement of the point. "You're correct that it might seem one-sided from a traditional military perspective, but consider the alternatives, Subcommander. Continued occupation means continued resistance, which means continued casualties, resource expenditure, and psychological stress for your forces. We're offering you the opportunity to end this campaign with your military reputation intact." Dr. Morrison added technical incentives that revealed the depth of human strategic thinking. "We're also prepared to share certain innovations we've developed during this conflict. Improvements to energy distribution systems, enhanced electromagnetic shielding techniques, and adaptive manufacturing processes that might interest your industrial designers." The offer of technological exchange was perhaps the most psychologically jarring aspect of the entire negotiation. 4 months earlier, the humans had been a primitive species that Zephyrian science could have educated about basic physics. Now, they were offering to share innovations with their supposed technological superiors. "You've learned to modify our technology," Thexai observed. "But what makes you think your innovations would be valuable to us?" "Dr. Diability." Morrison smiled and activated a demonstration device that made Thexai's enhanced nervous system tingle with recognition. "Commander, this is a portable shield generator based on your power cell technology but using human modifications to the focusing crystals. It provides 87% of the protection of your standard personal shields, while using only 32% of the power. The demonstration was convincing enough to capture the attention of every Zephyrian officer present. Improved efficiency was always valuable, regardless of the source of the innovation. We've also developed communications encryption that your own systems can't break, Dr. Chen added with obvious pride. Not because our technology is more advanced, but because we've applied mathematical principles that your computer systems aren't programmed to recognize. The negotiation continued for hours, with both sides presenting analysis, counter-arguments, and strategic considerations. But gradually, Thekshay began to recognize that the fundamental dynamic had shifted in ways that traditional military thinking couldn't address. The humans weren't negotiating for their survival anymore. They were negotiating for terms that recognized their transformation from conquered subjects to legitimate opponents. They had earned respect through their resistance, and they were demanding acknowledgement of that achievement. "Commander," Chen said during a break in the formal discussions, "may I ask you a personal question?" Thekshay gestured for her to continue. "When you began this campaign, what did you expect to accomplish?" "Standard conquest protocol," he replied automatically. "Demonstration of superior force, rapid capitulation, integration into the empire with minimal resistance. And what have you actually accomplished?" The question forced him to confront the gap between expectation and reality. "We've learned that our understanding of primitive species was incomplete." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "You've also demonstrated something that we never expected to learn. That technological advancement and military capability don't automatically translate into the ability to control a determined population. You've taught us that we're capable of more than we realized." The conversation continued in directions that challenged Thekshai's understanding of conquest, resistance, and the relationship between different species. The humans weren't bitter about the casualties they had suffered or resentful about the destruction to their world. Instead, they seemed to view the entire experience as an educational opportunity that had accelerated their development as a civilization. "This conflict has changed us," General Rodriguez explained. "We've learned to cooperate globally in ways that were impossible before external pressure forced us to work together. We've accelerated our technological development by decades. We've discovered capabilities we didn't know we possessed. You've also paid a tremendous price in casualties and destruction," Subcommander Kelness pointed out. "Yes," Dr. Chen agreed without hesitation. "But we've learned that some things are worth any price. Freedom, self-determination, the right to make our own mistakes and discover our own destiny. You offered us advancement and protection, but at the cost of our independence. We've proven that we prefer to struggle and grow on our own terms." As the negotiation reached its conclusion, Thekshay found himself facing a decision that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the campaign. The humans had demonstrated that they could make continued occupation unbearably costly, but more importantly, they had earned something that no primitive species in his experience had ever achieved: his genuine respect. "Very well," he announced to his staff and the human delegation. "The Zephyrian Empire accepts your terms. Complete withdrawal within 30 standard days, mutual non-aggression treaty, and limited technological exchange according to protocols we'll establish separately." The relief on human faces was obvious, but it was mixed with something else that Thekshay had never seen in previous conquered species: pride. They had faced overwhelming odds and not only survived, but had forced their technologically superior opponents to treat them as equals. As the formal ceremonies concluded and both sides prepared for the complex logistics of military withdrawal, Chen approached Thekshay for a final private conversation. "Commander, I hope you understand that this wasn't about defeating the Zephyrian Empire or proving human superiority. It was about earning the right to determine our own future among the stars." Thekshay considered her words carefully before responding. "Chen, in 4 months of conflict, your species has taught me more about warfare, determination, and the nature of strength than 17 previous conquests combined. You've forced us to question our assumptions about technological superiority and the inevitability of our expansion methods." He paused, looking around the improvised negotiation chamber where two civilizations had found a way to end their conflict with mutual respect intact. Perhaps the most valuable lesson you've taught us is that sometimes the greatest victory is recognizing when you've encountered an opponent worthy of your respect rather than your conquest. 6 months later, as HFY compiled his final campaign report for the Zephyrian Imperial Command, he struggled to find adequate language to describe what had happened on Earth. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had transformed a military conquest into a learning experience that changed both civilizations. His report would force the Empire to reconsider its expansion protocols and develop new approaches for encountering species that possessed the same combination of determination, adaptability, and refusal to accept defeat that had made humanity such a formidable opponent. But perhaps most importantly, the humans had taught him that true strength wasn't measured by technological advancement or military power. It was measured by the willingness to defend what you believed in, regardless of the odds, and the intelligence to learn and adapt until you found a way to succeed. Looking back at Earth as his ship departed for Zephyrian space, Commander HFY carried with him the knowledge that he had encountered something truly special. A species that had proven that sometimes the impossible was simply another word for not yet achieved.